Good morning. I don't mind extra voices chiming in with the sermon, so please don't take anybody out just because they're making noise. They are welcome. Have you ever been in a situation where you didn't know what you didn't know until it was almost too late? I know that's a complicated question, but if you know you don't know something, that's not really a huge problem, right? Like your kid asks you a question and you have no idea of the answer, or you're at work and you need to know the exact size of the right, widget for this particular part of the job. And that's fine because you know what you don't know in that moment. And you can look it up on the internet or find a book in the library or ask a friend or, whatever. And sometimes, depending on when and where this is happening, you might even decide it's irrelevant to your life and you can ignore it for that matter. But what happens when you don't know that you don't know something? Then what? A few years ago, my brother-in-law and his family were packing their bags one Friday afternoon to fly out to New Zealand from England. Now, both my brother-in-law and his wife have family in the same town in New Zealand, and so they had saved up their money for months and months, I think maybe even a couple of years, and planned this trip to New Zealand. They'd bought the tickets, they're very expensive tickets. They had all these plans to see aunts and uncles and cousins who lived half a world away. And then 25 hours before they were meant to leave, my brother-in-law noticed that his wife's passport was set to expire while they were away. That was a significant problem. It's the type of problem they would have fixed easily weeks or even months earlier had they known. But they didn't know that they didn't know until right then. The requirements in both of the countries they were going to was that they had to have passports with at least 6 months' time on them after the end of their trip to be allowed to enter into the country in the first place. And so if they had arrived at the airport the next day with their non-refundable, highly expensive tickets and this passport in hand, my sister-in-law would not have been allowed to travel, would have lost her tickets in the process. My brother-in-law looked at the clock. It was 2:15 in the afternoon. They lived a 90-minute journey away from London, where the emergency passport office was located. The office closed for applications for the weekend at 4 o'clock. My sister-in-law managed to gather her documents and get to the train station in less than 15 minutes and caught the last train to London available on time. She managed to get to London, sorry guys, on time. And just because a train should get you somewhere by a certain point of time doesn't necessarily mean it did. So that was a pretty big deal as well. She then arrived at the passport office at 4:15, 15 minutes after the office had closed for applications, and yet somehow they took pity on her, accepted her application and the huge extra fee attached to it. And she sat down and waited. At 9 p.m., she finally left the passport office and began the journey back home, where she arrived less than 12 hours later before they left for the airport the next day. Now, I know my brother-in-law and his wife pretty well. They've been part of my world for most of the last 25 years or so. And these are careful, smart, planning types of people. I'm sure they had checked their passports and checked their flight details and other things a million times while planning for this trip over the course of 2 years. After all, it was a huge trip. And yet they almost missed the whole trip because she didn't know that she didn't know she hadn't checked the date on her passport. Have you ever been in a situation where you didn't know what you didn't know until it was almost too late? Like maybe you have. I feel like Roy maybe has because he's giggling over there. Maybe you haven't. Maybe you're a much more planning type of person than that. But this is going to be relevant to our passage today. Before we get there, though, we need a little bit of context. So Roy introduced us a couple of weeks ago to King Solomon the Wise, right? And then Nathan came back last week and pointed out that although King Solomon was seen as the strong and the great and the wealthy and the wise, he was also the last king of Israel to rule over a complete nation of Israel, because despite all that wisdom, he had married 300 wives and had 700 concubines from all over the region, and most, if not all of these women worshipped other gods. And over time, Solomon, again, despite all his wisdom, decided to worship these other gods alongside of his wives and concubines. And Nathan explained that what came next after all of that was that the kingdom of Israel became divided into Israel in the north and Judah in the south, and both of them had their own kingly line. And as you read through the books of 1st and 2nd Kings and 1st and 2nd Chronicles, you'll see that there's this pattern that happens, that in this world of hundreds of tribal gods, sometimes the kings of Judah and Israel will remember to worship the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And when they follow this Israelite God who led them out of Egypt and into the land flowing with milk and honey, things go really well under their reigns. But more often than not, both the kings of Israel and the kings of Judah worship the gods of the people around them, gods like Baal and Dagon and the goddesses like Asherah. And the result, according to the writers of Chronicles and Kings, is that the God of the Israelites gives them over to drought and famine and the swords of the people surrounding them. Now, one of the people surrounding Israel at this time is the kingdom of Aram to the north of Israel, the kingdom whose capital is Damascus in modern-day Syria. And about 100 years after Israel becomes the divided kingdom, after the death of Solomon, when King Jehoram is on the throne of the northern kingdom of Israel in the capital city of Samaria, there are raids taking place across its northern border. And those raids take place by the people of Aram. This is where our passage this morning in 2 Kings 5 comes from. And we read early on that those raids are being led by a man named Naaman, the commander of the entire army of Aram. Now, as we are introduced to Naaman, along with being told that he is the commander of the entire army of Aram, we also learn that he is highly favored by his king, that he's a mighty warrior, and that he has leprosy. Now, it turns out that the word leprosy is used pretty widely across a multitude of skin conditions in the Old Testament. They didn't have a life labs at the time where they could go and present a sample of their skin for testing to find out what was causing the skin issues. So if you had something wrong with your skin and it turned white and was uncomfortable, then that was probably leprosy. But whatever was actually the cause of Naaman's condition, there was a huge amount of shame and stigma involved in having leprosy at the time. And that was there regardless of what the underlying medical condition may or may not have been. And if it was truly what we call leprosy or Hansen's disease today, then it was a condition that would progress with time, causing nerve damage to first his fingers and toes, and then up his arms and legs, as well as affecting his eyes and therefore his sight. And it's said that with leprosy, you can become unrecognizable even to your closest family and friends. It's worse even than having to wear a face mask. That's because the worse the nerve damage with leprosy gets, the less likely you are to feel the sensation of having a stone in your sandal, or your feet too close to the fire, or the reins chafing at your hands as you drove your chariot, or pounded your grain, or hefted your water jugs, or used your hammer. And so the skin, it would break down and infections would set in, and eventually the only option well before the days of antibiotics, was to amputate again and again and again until all that was left of you, legs, arms, and face, was stumps. So once you realized you had leprosy, that is exactly what you would expect to have happen. So that was likely what Naaman expected too. And quite possibly what Naaman would have ended up with, except, as was common in those days, each time there was a successful raid, the winners would make off with the spoils of the raid. So whatever wealth or objects or people they could capture, those were shipped back home and divided amongst the raiding parties. And at some point during these years, Naaman had taken back with him an Israelite girl, given her to his wife as a slave. And whether it was as soon as she arrived or weeks, months, even years after she came to live in the house of Naaman, this Israelite girl eventually said to her mistress, "If only my Lord were with the prophet who is in Samaria, he would cure him of his leprosy." Wait, what's she talking about? It turns out that although the Israelites had more or less abandoned God the Lord, at this point, God the Lord had not abandoned the Israelites. In fact, they had been given a series of prophets over the years who had attempted to remind the Israelites and the Israelite kings of their covenant with God and of what it meant to follow God faithfully, worship God with trust and with presence, the way Nathan talked about last week. And somehow, before she was taken away into slavery in Aram, this young girl had clearly heard of stories of the prophet Elisha. Clearly, this young girl had understood and believed not only in the prophet, but in the power of the prophet to heal by God's power. Perhaps she even believed fully in God. Perhaps she daily sought to follow God's commands as best she could, even in this land so far from home. If so, this slave girl was doing better than most of the Israelites of the day, including the king. But in my experience, that is not always so surprising. I think, like so many young girls, like so many surprising people that we meet in our lives who seem like they're off the beaten track, she had taken in all that faith and all that trust in God because she risked speaking up and promising that Naaman would be cured if only he were with the prophet in Samaria. I think when she does this, she puts her life on the line. But she trusts enough that she still speaks up. And when she speaks up, Naaman the rich, Naaman the powerful, Naaman the mighty leans in and listens with humility to the words of this foreign slave girl and realizes there is something really important he didn't even know he didn't know, but that he really needed to know before it was too late. So Naaman hurriedly goes to his king. He's the commander of the king's army, after all, and he can't really do very much without the king's say-so. But he is clearly in high favor, because when he asks permission of the king for leave to travel to Samaria to go and seek help, the king of Aram grants that permission. Naaman is his commander-in-chief. He's a mighty warrior. The king of Aram needs him to be healthy and capable and full of life, so maybe it's not so surprising that he says yes. But not only that, he sends a letter with Naaman to the king of Israel, asking for his help in getting Naaman healed. So Naaman packs up supplies and food, tents and servants, and he begins what is a 1,150-kilometer, month-long trip from Damascus to Samaria over almost non-existent rock-studded trading routes. Along with the letter of introduction from his king, Naaman brings with him 10 talents of silver, 6,000 shekels of gold, and 10 sets of garments, lavish, costly, expensive gifts. Like my sister-in-law discovering her passport would be rejected, once Naaman realized that he could be healed, he immediately set off on a massive journey in the hopes that he might find healing. And after weeks of travel, Naaman arrives in the capital of Israel, Samaria, and presents himself and the letter from the king of Aram to King Jehoram. The letter reads, "When this letter reaches you, know that I have sent to you my servant Naaman, that you may cure him of his leprosy." But when King Jehoram sees it, he isn't excited about this. He's not pleased in the slightest. In fact, he is distraught. He assumes he's being set up by the king of Aram, who, in turn, he assumes is trying to find an excuse to go to war with him. King Jehoram knows he's not powerful enough to go up against the king of Aram right now, but more to the point, King Jehoram has no idea what God, the Lord of Israel, is capable of, even though he is king of Israel. And so he doesn't even consider calling for the prophet Elisha. In fact, he's about to send Naaman back to Aram unhealed when, lucky for Jehoram, one of Elisha's servants hears the wailing coming from the throne room, investigates what's going on, and runs and tells Elisha. And Elisha sends the servants back to King Jehoram with a message for him. "Why have you torn your clothes? Let him come to me, that he may learn that there is a prophet in Israel." So it turns out, that King Jehoram also didn't know what he didn't know until it was almost too late for him as well. But at the very last minute, the message comes through, and King Jehoram has the good sense to send Naaman to see Elisha. But when Naaman arrives in front of Elisha's house, he isn't greeted like the very important person he thinks and knows himself to be. Perhaps he expects Elisha to be waiting for him at the door, or maybe he assumes he'll be ushered in and wined and dined. Possibly that he'll be given the best room in the house while he convalesces exuberantly under Elisha's care. Whatever it is he is expecting, it's not what happens, because instead Elisha sends his servant out to greet Naaman with a simple message. "Go, wash in the Jordan 7 times, and your flesh shall be restored, and you shall be clean." Naaman is irate. He is seething. Does Elisha have no idea who he is? Does he not care how far he's come? Does he think this is some sort of a game, or that he's the type of person to be trifled with? In the words that follow this announcement, we read of a man fuming with rage, and you can almost hear the wheels turning in his head as he plans his next, far more vicious attack against Israel. Until all of a sudden his servant pipes up and says, "Father, if the prophet had commanded you to do something difficult, would you not have done it? How much more when all he said to you was, 'Wash and be clean'?" And something in Naaman must have decided it was worth a shot. He had already, by this point in time, started the trip back to Aram, but he realizes that once again, there is something he didn't know that maybe he needed to know. And maybe at that exact moment, he also realized just how itchy or tingly or uncomfortable his skin was, and he figured it was worth a shot. Whatever it is, we're told that Naaman turned around, went to the Jordan River, and washed 7 times, just as Elisha had said. Now, First time he washed in the river, nothing happened. He got up, same deal. Second time, same thing, still has leprosy. Third time, the fourth time, the fifth time, the sixth time. He washes all 6 times, and something about this day and this trip and the whole experience of realizing there were things he didn't know, things that he had been missing up to that point, means that Naaman doesn't give up after 6 times. Something had gotten to him, because even after all of that, Naaman washed one final time. And he came up clean. We're told that his flesh was restored to that of a young boy. It's really quite miraculous. And Naaman is now ecstatic. He races back to Elisha's house to thank him and tries to shower him with all of the wealth and the gifts and the things he's brought with him, but Elisha will have none of it. So then he makes an unusual request. Please, Elisha, can I take 2 cartloads of Israelite soil back to Aram with me? As one does when one has been healed of leprosy, right? That's perfectly logical. It sounds like a really weird thing to ask for, but the peoples of this time thought that gods were rooted in a specific geographic land. And they sought long and hard to figure out what gods should be worshipped wherever they were so that they would prosper. But the gods could only be worshipped in the right geographic place. And so Naaman's request reveals what he has discovered. That God, the Lord of Israel, God, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, is the God he wants to worship. And he wants the 2 cartloads of Israelite soil with him so that when he gets back to Aram, he can worship the God of Israel properly on Israelite soil. Because Naaman has realized that not only did he not know that the prophet Elisha could heal, and not only did he not know that he needed to humble himself for that healing to take place, but he didn't know that the God of Israel was the God he'd been looking for his whole life. The God he needed to serve, the one who was capable of healing him emotionally and physically. Elisha grants him his request and sends him on his way without payment. It's a good day for the prophet because someone has come to understand who God is and the importance of worshiping him. And it's a good day for Naaman. And I want to pause here and notice, Naaman has been healed, but that is not the only miracle that happened in this story, is it? Let's be clear, it's a big deal, almost miraculous, really, that in the ancient world, centuries and centuries before you could search Google to find the best doctor to heal your condition, Naaman heard about Elisha. It's a big deal, almost miraculous, really, that this slave girl he decided to take back to his wife was one of the very few followers of God in Israel at the time and had enough faith to speak up in the first place about Elisha. It's a big deal, almost miraculous, really, that Naaman listened with enough humility to hear and act based on this wild statement. And it's a big deal, almost miraculous, really, that at a time when Israel wasn't mostly interested in following God and was missing out on the healing that God wanted to offer because of it, that this foreigner, this outsider, would be granted healing and a new level of wholeness because of a faith that was almost entirely missing from God's people at that very moment of time. I could go on, but I think we sometimes focus on the miracle of the healing of Naaman's body and miss all the other miracles that came around before and after this story. Ultimately, like my sister-in-law, who not only realized her passport was about to expire, but managed to get up to London and get it sorted out before they had to leave, Naaman realized some very important things just in time. And this was almost miraculous, really. He realized there was a prophet in Israel who could heal him. He was given an escort to the prophet's house. His servant helped him see the importance of humbling himself to listen to the prophet's instructions. And ultimately, he realized that the God of Israel was a God of power and might, capable of healing his leprosy. And he concluded that he needed to worship Israel's God from here on in. And all that is great, but what about us? This can feel like a story that's so utterly disconnected from our lives. A long time ago and a long way away, dealing with a condition that none of us have. Except I think most of us can relate to the idea that it's hard to know what we don't know before we need to know it, right? Life is full of all these twists and turns, and it's so challenging to know how to plan for the next right step. Anyone who makes a habit of making 5-year plans or New Year's resolutions or whatever knows now just how well those 2020 plans ended up going. If you're anything like me, not only did you not end up doing anything you had on the plan, but you ended up doing all sorts of things that were never on the plan. I started a master's degree. That was not on the plan. And while I think COVID has made that more intense, I think it's always been true, right? Because we can't predict the future. And if you're anything like me, the next few months feel particularly challenging to predict. So if we don't have a crystal ball and we can't see into the future, what can we do? How can we live in such a way that we can cope with all of the things we don't even know we don't know yet? I think the story of Naaman gives us a couple of pieces of wisdom, ways we can live and attitudes of the heart that can stand us in good stead moving forward. These pieces of wisdom really build off what Nathan was talking about last week in terms of trusting God with our futures. The first piece of wisdom is that we need to listen with humility. 2 separate times in this story, Naaman the mighty, Naaman the powerful, Naaman the important is spoken to directly or indirectly by his slave and his servant. And both times their suggestions are counter to his assumptions about how the world works and about what he wanted to do most of all. But both times, Naaman listened. And because he listened, Naaman heard what he needed to hear and acted on that information. And because of that, he was healed. So, if we want to set ourselves up for what we don't even know we need to know yet, the first thing we need to do is practice listening with humility. Of course, for listening with humility to be possible, we need to be surrounded by community. Otherwise, we won't have anyone to listen to, right? If Naaman had lived off on his own somewhere doing his own thing, or if he had traveled to Israel on his own, he wouldn't have had community around him to point out what he was missing. On our own, we are left with just our own perspective. And when we do life in community, though, we have the opportunity to bounce ideas off of one another, shifting slightly here and there in our perspectives, and sometimes hearing clearly and maybe even pointedly from someone we love and trust that we're missing something major. That's important. To be ready for what we don't know we need to know yet, we need to be in community so that we can listen with humility. But honestly, just because someone wants to comment on your life doesn't guarantee that they know what they're talking about, does it? This is why I think Naaman's story points out one final piece. Naaman's big take-home lesson, as it were. After everything he's been through, Naaman recognizes that he needs to find a way to commune regularly with God. Having discovered that the God of Israel was a God of power and might, a God of healing and restoration, Naaman wasn't just interested in coming back for occasional visits with God when he was on a raid. He didn't just want to pop in once a year and say, "Hi." Instead, he asked to take 2 carts of earth back to Aram with him so that he could regularly worship not the God of his upbringing, but the God of his captured Israelite slave girl, the God of Elisha, the God who had guided his steps through all the things he didn't even know he didn't know, until he was right where he needed to be, doing right what he needed to do to be healed. The same God who would eventually come in the person of Jesus to show us who God is with skin on so that we could worship more freely and more fully than ever before is the God that Naaman met in that moment. But worshiping God regularly, focusing on what God is saying to us and what God says about how we should live, this is what's going to help us check whether the community we have around us is the type we should be listening to with humility. Because just because someone is speaking doesn't mean that they're correct. Just because someone's convinced they know what you need to do doesn't mean you should automatically do it. We need checks on what we're hearing, and the best check of all is to be connecting regularly with God, praying, reading Scripture, practicing the other spiritual disciplines we talked about over this winter, so that we can check whether what we're being told lines up with how God has always designed us to live. And so along with cultivating a community we can listen to with humility, we need to be spending time with God, listening to God, worshiping God. It can be so easy for these things to fall by the wayside. Obviously, we can get busy and we stop connecting with each other. We can start to feel successful and secure, and we stop listening to those around us, if they're even still there. But I was thinking this week about the ways life can shift and change. And even when we think we have all of these spiritual disciplines in place, we notice that it turns out we're not doing them anymore because our habits have fallen out of play. So here's my challenge for you today. I want you to take a few minutes this afternoon or evening, and I want to ask you to do a bit of reflection. When was the last time you were actually listening to the wisdom of those around you? When was the last time you spent time deeply in community, sharing a coffee on the porch or down by the waterfront, or a beer around a bonfire, and just soaking deeply in relationships you know help you to live and be more fully the person Jesus would be if Jesus were you? And when and how are you showing up to worship God these days? Beyond just listening to me preach or singing along with the songs on Sunday morning, are you finding other ways to connect daily with God and with who God is and how God wants you to live? In other words, is there something you need to adjust today that it would allow you to have what you need when you need it, even when you don't even know yet what it is you don't know? I'm going to ask the worship team to come back up as I pray.